San Luis Valley, Colorado Territory, August 1878. The sun was a hammer in the thin, high-altitude air, beating down on the valley floor nestled between the Sangre de Cristos and the San Juans. Most men were racing the calendar, chinking the last gaps in their log cabins, stockpiling wood, preparing for the inevitable siege of a Rocky Mountain winter, all except Joseph Eichner. He was building a wall, but it was the strangest wall anyone had ever seen. It wasn't a fence to keep cattle in, or a foundation to build upon. He was stacking a dry ring of fieldstone around his already finished cabin, leaving a gap between the dark logs and the pale granite. The gap was wide enough for a man to walk through, a full 3 feet of empty space. The stone wall itself was another 3 feet thick, rising slowly, methodically, under his patient hands. It was an immense undertaking, a fortress of useless air. Caleb Rourke, the man who had built half the cabins in the settlement and consulted on the rest, stopped his wagon, chewing on a piece of straw. He was a practical man, a builder who understood the realities of wood, weight, and winter. What he was seeing made no sense. He watched as Joseph, a quiet man from the Austrian Tyrol, carefully selected a flat-faced stone and levered it into place. "Eichner," Rourke called out, his voice carrying the easy authority of proven expertise. "What in God's name are you building?" Joseph paused, wiped sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand, and looked over. "A wall?" he said, his English thick but clear. "I can see it's a wall," Rourke said, stepping down from his wagon. A few other settlers, Silas Croft and Jebediah Finch among them, had gathered to watch the peculiar labor. "What I don't see is the purpose. There's no mortar. A good wind will push it over." "It will stand," Joseph said, turning back to his work. Rourke walked closer, squinting at the construction. "Even if it does, what's it for? Decoration? Man, you have firewood to cut. That's a month of labor you're burying in a rock pile." He kicked a loose stone. "You know what stone does in winter, don't you? It steals heat. It's a heat sink. You're building a ring of ice around your family. All you're doing is wasting a summer's labor to build yourself a colder grave." The other men murmured in agreement. It was common knowledge. Stone was cold. A stone hearth was one thing. It could hold the fire's heat. But a freestanding wall? It would just suck the life out of the cabin. They called it Eichner's folly. The man was either mad or foolish, and in this high, unforgiving country, the two were often fatal partners. Joseph simply placed another stone. The sound of granite grating on granite the only reply. What did this Tyrolean quarryman, a man who had spent his life splitting stone from mountainsides, understand about the physics of conduction that a seasoned frontier builder like Caleb Rourke had missed? What secret was held in that 3-foot gap of seemingly useless air? The answer would not come in arguments or explanations. It would come with the cold, a cold so deep and relentless it would rewrite the rules of survival in the San Luis Valley forever. If you stick with me through this story, I promise you will learn a fundamental principle of thermodynamics that is as relevant to modern home building as it was to a lone settler in 1878. This channel is dedicated to uncovering the forgotten genius of the past. So, subscribe, hit the like button, and tell us in the comments. What's the strangest, most counterintuitive solution you've ever seen that actually worked? Joseph Eichner was not a carpenter. He was not a farmer. And he certainly wasn't a frontiersman in the way the other settlers were. He was a man shaped by stone. Back in the Tyrol, he hadn't built with logs. He had worked in the high quarries, splitting massive sheets of granite and marble from the Alps. His hands understood the language of stone, the feel of a fault line, the sound of a perfectly struck wedge, the immense patient weight of the earth. He knew the secrets of feather and tear, the small wedges that could cleave a boulder. He knew that stone wasn't just heavy, it was a sponge for temperature, absorbing the midday sun and bleeding it back into the cool mountain nights. He and his wife Helga, with their 2 children, Klaus and Lena, had come to America seeking land. They found it in the San Luis Valley, a vast flat basin of stunning beauty and brutal extremes. They built their cabin the way everyone else did, following the local custom. They felled the pines, notched the logs, and chinked the gaps with a mixture of mud and grass. It looked sturdy. It looked like a home. Then their first winter came. It was a normal winter for the valley, which meant it was savagely cold for a family accustomed to more temperate alpine climates. The failure of their home was not sudden or catastrophic. It was a slow, seeping defeat. Joseph would wake in the morning to see beautiful traceries of frost outlining the mud chinking between the logs on the inside of the cabin. The cold wasn't just outside, it had worked its way into the very seams of their shelter. The children's boots, left by the hearth, would be stiff as iron in the morning. Helga complained that a cup of coffee went from scalding to lukewarm before she could finish it. They burned through their woodpile at a terrifying rate, the big cast-iron stove glowing red, yet the corners of the single room remained bitingly cold. They were living in a constant, draining battle against heat loss, a battle they were slowly losing. Joseph knew they would not survive a truly harsh winter, not like this. He wasn't fighting the cold, he was fighting the very material of his house. The problem wasn't the chinking, or the stove, or the quality of the logs. The problem was conduction. Conduction is the transfer of heat through direct contact molecule to molecule. Imagine holding a metal poker and putting one end in a fire. The heat doesn't jump to your hand. It travels up the solid shaft of the poker, exciting each particle along the way, until your palm registers the burn. A log wall, no matter how thick, is a solid bridge. The heat from inside the cabin, precious energy from the burning wood, would warm the inner surface of the logs. Those warmed wood molecules would then vibrate against their neighbors, passing the energy along until it reached the outside surface of the log, where the frigid, dry air of the valley would strip it away instantly. A well-built log cabin in a milder climate works fine, but the San Luis Valley was different. At 7,600 feet, the air is thin, offering less insulative value. The winds are relentless, accelerating heat loss through a process called convection. A standard 12-inch pine log has an R value, a measure of thermal resistance, of about 15. A modern, poorly insulated wall has a similar value. It was simply not enough to combat temperatures that regularly plunged to 20 below zero. The settlers' cabins were heat sieves. They survived by burning colossal amounts of firewood, spending half their waking hours feeding the stove. Caleb Rourke's cabins were the best in the valley, tightly notched, meticulously chinked, but they still obeyed the same unforgiving law of physics. They bled heat from every square inch of their surface. Joseph saw his neighbors constantly battling this invisible enemy, their children always bundled in coats indoors, their reserves of fuel dwindling with each passing week. He knew there had to be a better way, and his mind, trained in the properties of stone, went back to the quarries. The following spring, Joseph began his work. He didn't fell more trees to thicken his walls. He didn't import some expensive new material. He turned to the one resource the valley had in abundance, fieldstone, weathered and rounded by ancient rivers. He spent weeks with a horse and a stone boat, hauling rocks from the alluvial fans at the base of the mountains. He chose them carefully, looking for flat faces and stable shapes. He laid a shallow footing, a simple trench filled with crushed rock to create a stable base. Then he began to stack. He built his outer wall 3 feet away from his cabin, creating the air gap that so puzzled his neighbors. This was the first stroke of genius. Then came the second. The wall itself was dry stacked. No mortar, no chinking. He carefully interlocked the stones, using their own immense weight and friction to create a stable, solid structure. This method, common in the ancient hills of his homeland, was alien here. As he worked through the summer, the wall of mockery grew alongside the wall of stone. "Going to keep the jackrabbits out, Joseph?" Silas Croft would call out with a grin. Jebediah Finch, a man who believed religiously in the insulating power of a thick sod roof, would shake his head. The man's building his own tombstone. Caleb Rourke made his formal objection in late September, when the wall was waist-high. He represented the voice of established, hard-won frontier wisdom. "Joseph," he said, his tone more concerned than mocking, "I've been building in these mountains for 15 years. I know what works. Wood is warm. Stone is cold. You're putting a cold mass right next to your warm wood. It's going to draw the heat out faster. It's physics." Joseph paused, setting a heavy stone on the course. He looked at the builder, then at his log wall, then at the stone wall. "The stone does not touch the wood," he said quietly. "The air will get just as cold," Rourke insisted, exasperated. "It's a crazy amount of work for nothing, man. You could have built a whole new woodshed in the time you've spent on this folly." "The air is the point," Joseph said, and turned back to his work. He never argued. He never defended himself. He just kept stacking. The mockery lasted for a summer. The validation would last for a century. By the first snowfall in October, the stone jacket was complete. It rose to the eaves of his cabin, a massive, pale gray ring 3 feet thick, separated from the dark logs by that curious, shaded walkway of air. It looked ancient, primal, like the ruins of some forgotten fortification. His cabin now looked like a small wooden kernel inside a thick stone shell. Now let's break down the science of what Joseph had built, because it wasn't madness. It was a sophisticated, multi-layered thermal defense system. The frontier wisdom that stone is cold was only a partial truth. More accurately, stone is a poor insulator but an excellent thermal mass. This means it conducts heat well, but it also takes a very long time to change temperature, whether heating up or cooling down. A single stone wall would indeed be a terrible choice for a house, as it would leach heat continuously. But Joseph hadn't built a single stone wall. He had built 3 distinct thermal barriers. Barrier 1, the log wall. This was his primary structure. It was still a poor insulator, but it was the barrier that held the warm air inside his home. Barrier 2, the 3-foot air gap. This was the most critical piece of the puzzle. Caleb Rourke was wrong when he said the air would get just as cold. He was thinking of moving air, of wind, which strips heat away through convection. But the air in Joseph's gap was trapped. It was sheltered from the wind by the massive stone wall. This stable, unmoving pocket of air is called a dead air space, and it is one of the most effective insulators in existence. Air itself is a terrible conductor of heat. Its molecules are spread far apart, and they don't transfer thermal energy to each other efficiently. This is the principle behind modern double-paned windows, fiberglass insulation, and even the puffy-down feathers of a bird. Joseph had wrapped his entire home in a 3-foot-thick blanket of air, Barrier 3, the outer stone jacket. This was the master stroke, the part that came from his quarryman's soul. Rourke saw a heat sink. Joseph saw a thermal flywheel. The 3-foot-thick stone wall had enormous thermal mass. It would take a tremendous amount of energy and a very long time for the winter cold to penetrate it fully. It acted as a massive breakwater for the waves of cold that crashed over the valley each night. While the outer surface of the stone would get brutally cold, the inner surface, facing the air gap, would remain significantly warmer. It slowed the rate of temperature change to a crawl. So the system worked like this. The relentless winter wind hit the stone wall and was stopped dead. The brutal cold began its slow, laborious journey, molecule by molecule, through 3 feet of solid granite. By the time the cold had fully penetrated the stone and reached the inner surface, it encountered the 3-foot air gap, a thermal void. The trapped air refused to efficiently conduct the remaining cold across to the log wall. The cabin itself was therefore not exposed to -30 degrees Fahrenheit wind, but to the much more stable, still air of the protected gap, which might only be 20 degrees Fahrenheit or 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Joseph had effectively moved his cabin from the harsh climate of the San Luis Valley into a sheltered microclimate of his own creation. He had built a wall to stop the winter before it could even touch his home. That November, the valley freeze began. It was not a storm, but a quiet, lethal settling of Arctic air that refused to leave. For 18 consecutive nights, the temperature in the valley dropped below -30 degrees Fahrenheit. The river froze solid enough to drive a wagon over. Cottonwood trees, their sap frozen, cracked in the night with a sound like rifle shots. It was the kind of cold that found every crack, every weakness in a man's preparations. For Joseph's neighbors, it was a time of misery. They became slaves to their stoves, stuffing them with wood around the clock. The heat radiated a few feet out, creating a small island of warmth in a sea of biting cold. Water buckets left more than 5 feet from the fire froze solid. Families slept together in one bed, buried under every blanket they owned. They woke to find their own breath frozen in glittering crystals on their pillows. Condensation from cooking and breathing froze onto the interior walls, coating them in a layer of icy fuzz. Caleb Rourke, for all his skill, found himself fighting the same battle. His cabin was better than most, but he was still burning through a cord of wood every 10 days, a rate that would see his supply exhausted by February. At the Eichner cabin, life was different. The first few days of the freeze, Joseph fed the stove heavily, pouring heat not just into the small room, but into the log walls themselves. Then, something remarkable happened. The system reached equilibrium. The massive thermal mass of the stone jacket, now thoroughly chilled on its outer face, became a stable barrier. The dead air in the gaps stabilized. The log walls, no longer in a frantic battle with the outside air, held their warmth. The amount of wood Joseph needed to burn dropped dramatically. A few logs in the morning and a few at night were enough to keep the single room at a comfortable 65 degrees. The contrast was not just in numbers, it was in the quality of life. While others huddled, the Eichners lived. Helga would knead bread on the wooden table in the center of the room, the yeasty smell a testament to a warmth that was not just possible, but normal. Klaus and Lena, their children, would lie on a bearskin rug on the floor, drawing on slate boards, their fingers nimble, not stiff with cold. They wore shirt sleeves indoors. The windows had condensation, but the walls remained dry and warm to the touch. The brutal siege outside was a distant rumor, a thing heard in the howl of the wind over the stone jacket, but not felt within. A cup of coffee stayed hot. Boots stayed pliable. Life went on. The vindication did not come from a dramatic rescue or a desperate plea for shelter. Like the innovation itself, it was quiet, practical, and rooted in the necessities of work. Caleb Rourke was a builder, and the freeze was threatening his livelihood. He had a contract to plaster a new merchant store in the spring, and for that he needed lime. He had several dozen sacks of precious powdered lime stored in his workshop, a well-built but unheated shed. One morning, after a night that dropped to -38 degrees Fahrenheit, he went to check on his supply. He opened a sack and cursed. The fine powder had absorbed ambient moisture from the air and was now clumpy and partially hardened. The repeated cycles of deep freezing and slight thawing had ruined it. He was looking at a significant financial loss. In desperation, he tried to think of a place that was dry, but not heated. a place that might be safe from this deep, penetrating frost. And then he thought of Eichner's folly. He remembered the strange, sheltered walkway between the stone and the logs. He didn't understand it, but it was the only unique structure in the valley. Swallowing his pride, he hitched his wagon and drove the short distance to Joseph's homestead. He found Joseph splitting wood, his movements unhurried. The smoke rising from his chimney was a thin, lazy wisp, not the frantic plume that gushed from every other stovepipe in the settlement. Eichner, Rourke began, the cold making his words puff out in white clouds. I have a problem and a strange request. He explained about the lime. I'm wondering if I could store a few of my remaining sacks against the outside of your stone wall, just for a few weeks. It's a fool's hope, but my own shed is ruining them. Joseph nodded. Put them on the south side, he said. They will stay dry. Rourke, expecting an argument or at least a smug, I told you so, was taken aback by the simple acceptance. He stacked 10 sacks of lime on a wooden pallet right up against the base of the stone jacket, covered them with a canvas tarp, and went home, convinced he was a fool, but with no other options. A week passed. The cold did not break. It was the heart of the great freeze. Rourke, having lost more lime in his own shed, decided to check on the sacks at Joseph's. He drove over. His mind braced for disappointment. He expected to find 10 solid blocks, ruined just like the others. He pulled back the frozen canvas tarp. He looked at the sacks. They looked normal. He put a gloved hand on the nearest one. He had expected it to feel like a rock. Instead, the sack gave slightly under the pressure. His heart beat a little faster. He pulled off his glove, his bare skin stinging in the ferocious cold, and pressed his palm against the burlap. It was cold, yes, but it was a dry cold, and beneath the surface, he could feel that the contents were still a powder. He untied the top of the sack and plunged his hand in. It was like running his fingers through cool, dry sand. Perfect, usable. He stood there, baffled. It was 35 degrees below zero, and this lime was as dry as it had been in August. Then his builder's eye caught the detail that explained everything. The outer faces of the field stones were coated in a thick, feathery layer of hoarfrost. The stones were clearly drawing moisture from the air and freezing it, proof that they were far below the freezing point. But when he knelt down and peered into the 3-foot gap between the stone and the cabin, he saw the logs. They were bare. Not a speck of frost on them. They looked dark, dry, and from where he stood, impossibly warm. The proof was laid out before him not as a theory, but as a physical fact. The frost formed on the outer stone, but the inner logs stayed dry. The cold was stopping here at this massive, ridiculous wall. It was dying in the air gap. In that moment, Caleb Rourke understood. Joseph hadn't built a ring of ice around his house. He had built a cage to trap the winter. He retied the sack and slowly walked to where Joseph was calmly sharpening an axe. He stood there for a long moment, the steam from his breath pluming around his face. "You magnificent, stubborn Tyrolean fool," Rourke said, his voice full of a new and profound respect. "You didn't build a wall. You built a harbor. You put a calm day between you and the storm." Joseph just nodded, a faint smile touching his lips, and went back to his work. When the great freeze finally broke in January, the stories began to circulate. They were started by Caleb Rourke, no longer a skeptic but the innovation's most fervent advocate. He described his lime sacks, the dry powder, the frost on the outside, and the bare wood on the inside. He explained the principle of the dead air gap, using his hands to show how the cold was stopped before it could touch the house. He had been converted not by argument, but by undeniable physical proof. That spring, 3 more families, their woodpiles exhausted and their nerves frayed from the winter siege, approached Joseph. They didn't come to mock, they came to learn. Joseph, a man of few words, taught them with his hands. He showed them how to choose the stones, how to lay a stable base, how to lock the courses together without mortar. He never asked for payment. The knowledge, he believed, was like the stone itself. It was there for anyone with the strength and patience to use it. The idea spread like a spring thaw. The Eichner wall, or the stone jacket, became the new standard for any settler serious about surviving the valley. The local quarry yard, which had previously only sold stone for foundations and hearths, began offering perimeter kits. Piles of pre-sorted field stone, sold by the wagon load, specifically for building a thermal jacket. By 1880, less than 2 years after Joseph finished his wall, over 40 homesteads in the San Luis Valley had built their own versions. The change was transformative. Fuel consumption across the valley dropped by an estimated 40%. The brutal winter, once a near-death experience, was demoted to a mere inconvenience. Joseph Eichner's strange idea had fundamentally altered the relationship between the people and the place. This simple, powerful technique was an unwitting precursor to modern building science. Joseph's stone jacket was, in effect, a primitive rain screen and a super-insulated double-wall assembly. Modern high-performance homes are built on this exact principle: a weather-resistant outer cladding, a ventilated air gap, a thick layer of insulation, and an airtight inner wall. Joseph Eichner, with nothing more than fieldstone, patience, and the ingrained knowledge of a quarryman, had engineered a solution a century ahead of its time. There is a lesson in those stones that goes beyond thermal dynamics. The story of Joseph Eichner is a testament to the quiet power of outsider knowledge, the wisdom that often flourishes far from the center of accepted practice. The frontier valued conformity because it was a proven path to survival, but it was an outsider's nonconformity that allowed it to truly thrive. The other settlers saw a wall that separated a cabin from the world. Joseph saw a wall that protected the warmth within. He understood a principle that applies as much to communities as it does to cabins. Sometimes the most resilient structures are not those with the thickest, most monolithic defenses. They are the ones that understand the power of the space between. The wall that stands apart keeps the warmth within. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. If you found this story of ingenuity and resilience valuable, please consider subscribing to our channel and liking this video. It helps us to continue unearthing these incredible histories. And let us know in the comments what other historical innovations deserve to have their stories told. The content of this video is for educational and storytelling purposes. It presents a fictionalized narrative inspired by real historical building practices and scientific principles. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are products of imagination. Any application of historical techniques to modern construction should be done in accordance with current building codes, safety standards, and regulations, and with the guidance of qualified professionals. This video does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.